That was one of the aha moments when what you're quoting is the Heart Sutra. And it's full of complementarities, opposites. How can all these things be true? So we chant it, but do we understand it? As beginning Zen students, it's really opaque. So it just becomes this automatic chant. But as I started to explore complexity theory, um, is my body a finger? Is this finger that I'm holding up in front of you, is it a solid object? It sure looks like a solid object. But in studying complexity as applies to cells, is it that, or is it a flock of cells? You look at a murmuration of starlings, and if you don't know what it is when you first look at the sky, you see what looks like a balloon or a ship or a tree floating in the sky, and then you realize, oh, no, it's just starlings. Well, the bird looks like a thing, but at the cellular level, the bird disappears. It's just a flock of cells. And as I said before, at the nanoscopic level, the cell disappears. It's just a flock of molecules floating in water, which are, of course, other molecules. So it's just molecules bouncing. That's form as emptiness, emptiness as form. Both things are true. You can't ever favor one or the other because it's exactly 50-50. And those are the complementarities of the Heart Sutra. And then I realized, oh, wait, the science just explained the Heart Sutra to me. Holy shit. And the Heart Sutra, had I been paying attention, was telling me how to think about the science.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Neil Theise. Neil is a professor of pathology at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Through his scientific research, he's been a pioneer of adult stem cell plasticity, which led him to an interest in complexity theory. This interest has resulted in interdisciplinary collaborations in fields such as consciousness studies and the connection between science and spirituality, topics he explores in his new book, Notes on Complexity, and topics which we talk about today. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Neil Theise. Neil, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So maybe we can begin with a bit about your background, because you came to this, what we're going to be talking about today, in quite an interesting route.
Sure. Professionally, I'm an MD, and my specialty is pathology, diagnostic pathology. So I sit at a microscope most of the day, looking at people's tissues at the cellular level, at the tissue level. So if someone gets a biopsy, let's say, wondering if they have cancer or not, I'm the one who looks at the tissue, the slide, and says cancer, not cancer. And my specialty is liver pathology. And I do a lot of research, a lot of it's clinical research, comparing what I see on the slides to what's going on in the patients, developing new diagnostic criteria or better means to prognosis and things like that. But seeing disease in human tissues leads you to be able to do basic science stuff too. But instead of having to get grants to raise mice and rats to do experiments, I get human tissues to play with. And so that led me into, amongst a whole bunch of other things, into stem cell biology, adult stem cell biology. And it was through that research about 20 years ago that I was introduced to complexity theory. So that led me, in the broadest way possible, into my current book, which is on complexity theory, and in part what the implications are of that for understanding consciousness. On the other hand, I've had several long-term spiritual practices. I grew up in an observant Jewish household. I still maintain some aspects of Jewish practice. I was going to be a rabbi at one point instead of going to medical school. And academic study of Jewish mysticism in particular was interesting, but direct experiential practice in that, when I was growing up in the 70s as a kid in suburban New England, that wasn't available. I eventually wandered into Zen practice, as a way to develop a contemplative practice. And I've been a Zen student now for about 35 years. And so that also has its own way of thinking about consciousness and experiencing consciousness. And, sort of another experimental model, like looking at my human slides, I look at my human mind and discourse with other people who are looking at their own human minds. And so that leads to its own experiences and conceptions about what the mind is. And those two strands eventually, to my surprise, wound up merging around 20 years ago. And that's when my complexity theory adventure really sort of erupted.
And so the new book, Notes on Complexity, is kind of laying out a complexity, kind of looking at existence through a complexity lens, right? To show the kind of interdependence, unity, and is that how you would kind of describe it?
Yes. I realized after some plotting efforts that the universe can be described as a single unified complex system, and the particularities, the implications of complexity for any one particular system, let's say how ants form a colony, or in my case, where I started, how cells form tissues and organs and bodies, applied to how the universe functions. And complexity theory has been an important part for understanding how consciousness arises. It's been particularly important for a materialist perspective, with mind or consciousness being considered an emergent property of the brain as a complex system. By emergence, I mean a global property that arises from local interactions between the participating parts, interacting parts. So in ant colonies, how ants interact with each other on the local level without any top-down planning from the bottom up gives rise to emergent global structures like food lines, or where a cemetery is put, or digging tunnels, or creating a nursery for the queen ant to birth new ants. And so it seemed, and I thought this too when I initially encountered it, that maybe the magical properties of mind, like the kind of amazing properties of how ant colony structures arise without any top-down planning from local interactions, maybe our minds are emergent properties of the complex interactions of the brain's chemicals, cells, electrical signaling. And that's a general understanding for people who believe the brain makes mind. There are issues with that, and I turned eventually towards a panpsychist approach where mind is considered inherent in the universe, either inherent in living things such as cells. And I learned about that approach from Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela with their autopoietic theory, and their notion that if there is life, there is mind, and if there's mind, there's life, and the smallest living unit is the cell, and so cells carry consciousness. Others talk about conscious agents, for example, at the quantum level, like Donald Hoffman. Some people talk about it as an emergent property from space-time itself, and such as Sir Roger Penrose and Stu Hameroff. But to me, those still have the same issues with the hard problem. But complexity comes in there because you can think of it as, how do complex, tiny consciousnesses assemble themselves into a larger scale personal conscious or more complex consciousness like ours? So that also I found unsatisfying ultimately, partly because of the hard problem, and that kind of moved me into an idealist position that consciousness comes first. And that turned out to mesh very well and very easily, for a variety of reasons, with this notion of the universe as a complex system. So it sort of got turned inside out. The idea that complexity arises from consciousness, not that consciousness arises from complexity. And that's the second half of the book, exploring those ideas.
Right. the connection you made between mind and life there, that's so my background's in neuroscience, but I came to the conclusion that when it comes to consciousness, you do have to look deeper than the brain, and that
Yes.
as you write about in the book as well, that the correlations we observe doesn't mean that, as we know, it doesn't mean causation. There could be a deeper factor, right? That gives.
Right. And I think where you landed was at the cellular level, like
Yeah. So,
Varela did.
but so with Matarano, Varela, and Evan Thompson, who took it up afterwards, would agree with
Hmm.
you. I think that the hard
Yeah,
problems
I
with
know
brain.
Evan
So
well.
yeah, so they were quite. Uh, they made sure this was just cognition in terms of behavior, like all stuff that can be
Mhm.
looked at objectively. So they had this whole kind of neurophenomenological program of like. So I think Evan recently read a paper last year about coming back to this idea: could cells be conscious? Because I think they still seem to think nervous systems were going to be important in some way. So we get
Right.
into interesting kind of things about the sentience, in terms of like feeling in a valenced way, but maybe feeling without experience, like detecting. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, consciousness is
That that
always
was that was
separate
my
from
entry
feeling.
point too. And actually, it was from an associate of Varela's that I first became aware of him. One of my Zen teachers, Roshi Joan Halifax, and she was a founding member of the Mind and Life organization
Right.
that brought the Dalai Lama together with Varela and other scientists. And it was called Mind and Life because of this autopoetic idea. And so that's when I started exploring sentience. And my panpsychist paper with my physics collaborator, Minas Kafatos, um, uses Varela type definitions to explore sentience, and we came to the conclusion that there was no reason to stop at the cellular level, that there were demonstrable forms of simpler sentience all the way down. And I spent some time talking to I was invited into something called the Lindisfarne Fellowship, which was
Right.
Varela was part of, Joan was a founding member of, and Evan's been a member since he was a kid. That's how he got to know Varela. Actually, his father was the founder of the Lindisfarne Fellowship, and so he grew up with Varela as like his big brother, uh, good uncle, and so that's how Evan got into this. Um, there's been a frustrating and interesting split there because Varela was a student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and also experienced deep contemplative states. And part of his effort, I think, was very much to understand how those states relate to these seemingly simpler, more mechanical, that's not right, the right word, but forms of sentience. And then he passed away fairly young. And it seems the drift in the Mind and Life program has been to separate from looking at contemplative states as anything other than kind of epiphenomena of brain activity, which is not where he was experiencing it, you know. Um, and I haven't been in touch with Evan for a while. I don't know, but so the last time I hung out with them was at a Zen brain retreat at Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, Roshi Jones Center, where many of these meetings were held, and there was a split there between me sort of wrestling with how do you explain the states in Buddhist contemplation. And Richie Davison was more interested in studying what happens in the brain when you're in those states. He's the current head of Mind and Life in America, rather than understanding the relationship of those states of awareness to consciousness. So there's a tension there, and I haven't actually been following what Evan's done lately. If he's coming back around to that in some fashion, that's interesting to me.
Yeah, so the paper last year was on biopsychism. Yeah, this idea that all life is conscious, and
Mhm.
so it didn't touch on contemplative stuff, but yeah. So, but I definitely share your feeling that insights into non-duality, unity, whatever you want to call it, um, are are kind of important to factor in our analysis of this stuff. They're not
Yeah.
epiphenomenal. I've been using the term non-dual naturalism for how I kind of approach this stuff, which is that
Uh-huh.
taking non-duality seriously, but also wanting the kind of naturalistic impulse of like reason and evidence and fitting with science, not just ignoring science.
Right.
And I think so. I really resonate with your work as this kind of complexity approach, and we end up in slightly different places. But it's I would describe your approach as non-dual naturalism as well. It doesn't mean you have to have exactly the same worldview, but it's the unity, non-separation, is something that you really illustrate nicely. So maybe we can go into that.
Yeah.
The kind of
Yeah.
side of things.
Yeah. And in response to that, I'd say I thought I knew what I was writing in the book when I was writing it, and then I discovered, oh, it's actually there were some surprises for me. The book represents 20 years of laying out this information for lay people of all kinds, all ages. I lectured on this stuff without changing any of the language to my nephew's 5th grade class 20 years ago. And the parents had to call all the teachers and tell them they were holding the school buses because they didn't want to interrupt how the students were responding and asking questions. And it's very provocative stuff, and it hits people in an intuitive way. It's sort of like, oh yeah, the world does work like that. I just never had labels for it. But I think what my intention was, not so much to state a position that I was going to be, oh, New York City noise. Sorry.
That's fine.
I think my intention in my head was not necessarily to state a definitive position one way or the other, but to at least make a case that from a complexity theory standpoint, interwoven with the other hard sciences, that idealism, that mind comes first, was a valid thing to discuss scientifically and intellectually. And it was sort of a soft sort of thing. But as I wrote the book and found I had to be much more specific than in giving a 45-minute talk, and really sharpen my arguments, when it was done and I reread it, I realized, oh, wow, this is pretty damn anti-materialist. It's really, I'm like, no, materialism, untenable, which surprised me. So,
it's interesting. The writing process can have that effect, right?
yeah.
Someone said they have to like write a book to understand what it is they think about something.
Yeah. And now I've had that experience. I mean, to some extent, I've had to write papers to understand what I was thinking about, in my research beyond this, which I've written far more about. And this is my first book for a general audience, which is also a different experience. But yeah, I mean, if I'm successful at getting people to engage this possibility with seriousness in a way, for example, I could not get Richie Davison to engage it when we met for those meetings. That alone would be an accomplishment for me.
Yeah, I think if you look back at different philosophical traditions, especially in kind of within Buddhism and other spiritual traditions, there's always been a diversity of shifting back and forth between kind of mind-only ontologies and other ontologies, and we do come up against this fact of consciousness that we can't put under a microscope and examine it and know 100% for sure. And I think we currently live in a time where there is this siloing where people tend to kind of just say like, I'm right, you're wrong, and you're stupid if you disagree with me. And I think the wise place to end up isn't that we're all going to say this is 100% definitely what's going on, but we're going to have a kind of distribution of like where people kind of lean based on their biases and what seems reasonable. I don't think it needs to be, at the moment, there's a really radical diversity. You can really believe anything you want about consciousness. And so,
I'm sorry, you can finish.
Narrowing things down to a few reasonable, ideas, but then allowing that it doesn't have to be, everyone doesn't have to see things the same way, I think is the wise place to end up.
Right. Well, and this is a very, very important part of the book. I discuss, the whole middle section discusses this notion of complementarity, and that one view may be correct, but it may not be sufficient. And that word is most well known in quantum physics. Niels Bohr coined it there for this observation that depending how you design the experiment, light will behave either like waves or as particles. And initially it was thought that the well-designed experiment will finally show us that it is this or this. And the famous double slit experiment, without going into the details, showed that there were two ways to construct this experiment, and the choice you make in constructing it determines whether light is waves or particles. And he expressed it that both are necessary for a complete understanding of the nature of light, but you can only see one aspect of it or the other depending on your choice of perspective, observation, experimental method. And in the book, I try to make this easy for people to understand in terms of that famous image where you have two profiles of faces in silhouette looking at each other, and you see two faces looking at each other, but the space between them looks like a vase. And if you focus on the vase, you see the vase. If you focus on the faces, you see the faces. And both of those are correct. You can kind of only see one at a time. You have to choose which one am I going to see. And the true description, the truest description of the image is that it is both two faces and the vase, but you can only experience one or the other. And Bohr actually believed this to be a foundational aspect of all existence, and discussed how there was probably complementarities across scales in all systems, including living systems. And one of the outcomes of complexity theory, analyzing it this way, is that it shows the universe is made of complementarities through and through, from the smallest quantum levels all of the way up to the universal scale. And I can give some concrete examples of that if you want me to. I don't want to veer too far from the conversation, but I think that theories of consciousness to some extent may also be complementarities. That if you look at it this way, the organizational structure of the brain is conditioning consciousness in some fashion, and so that is true, but it is not exclusively true. The idea that consciousness underlies something may give rise to panpsychist kind of mechanisms for how consciousness propagates through into direct things like human experience. And these are not incorrect as much as just details of the mechanisms. And wherever you want to focus, it's like our bodies are not, you can describe our bodies in terms of mechanics, like, my arm moves this way. It's all levers and pulleys in some extent. But that's not going to explain how cells are organizing into tissues and cellular physiology. And that's cell biology. But then we know we can go down to the molecular level, and the cell ceases to exist at that level. It's just molecules floating in water, interacting. And so on. The molecules are just interacting atoms are just interacting subatomic particles. And you can only study really one of those at a time. Systems approaches allow you to see how you move from scale to scale. But when you want to study any particular scale, it's going to exclude the others. And so you're going to get your particular specialized view. Like you said, in our culture, across all sorts of systems, social, political, economic, as well as biological, everyone's like, no, I'm right, you're wrong. But, well, within your frame of reference, from your particular stance and perspective, that makes sense and that's useful, but you're excluding others. And the moment you shift your focus to capture those, the moment you shift from the two faces to the vase, you gain the vase, but now you've lost the faces. And we sort of have to return, if we ever had it, to a sense of humility rather than hubris about what is a correct view. And you mentioned mind only, and there are some people who have on Amazon and Goodreads critiqued me for returning to a mind only Buddhism. It's like, well, you're not reading me carefully. It's mind only from this perspective. but we also exist in samsara and in the world of duality. And from that standpoint, it's not mind only. The world is material. The mistake is to think you've seen it as only this or only this.
Yeah. As a Zen
I go
student,
on
I'm
rants.
sure
I'm sorry.
form is emptiness, emptiness is form must be rattling around your brain for decades at this
Well,
point. And so,
no, exactly. And I'm a Zen student, so that obviously uh, that was one of the aha moments when what you're quoting is the Heart Sutra, and is notoriously opaque, and
till it
we
isn't.
chant it in the Zendos as a text. There is only old age, suffering, and death. There is no end to old age, suffering, and death. That it's full of complementarities, opposites. How can all these things be true? So we chant it, but do we understand it? As beginning Zen students, it's really opaque. So it just becomes this automatic chant. But as I started to explore complexity theory, is my body a finger? Is this finger that I'm holding up in front of you, is it a solid object? It sure looks like a solid object. But in studying complexity as applies to cells, is it that, or is it a flock of cells? You look at a murmuration of starlings, and if you don't know what it is when you first look at the sky, you see what looks like a balloon or a ship or a tree floating in the sky, and then you realize, oh no, it's just starlings. Well, the bird looks like a thing, but at the cellular level, the bird disappears. It's just a flock of cells. And as I said before, at the nanoscopic level, the cell disappears. It's just a flock of molecules floating in water, which are, of course, other molecules. So it's just molecules bouncing. That's form as emptiness, emptiness is form. Both things are true. You can't ever favor one or the other because it's exactly 50-50. And those are the complementarities of the Heart Sutra. And then I realized, oh wait, the science just explained the Heart Sutra to me. Holy shit. And the Heart Sutra, had I been paying attention, was telling me how to think about the science. Again, not one better than the other, completely 50-50. Some Buddhists get mad at me because someone actually said to me once, a Buddhist monk, when I was visiting Upaya Zen Center, actually, said to me, the Buddha doesn't need your science to explain his insights. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but people like me, it's a helpful finger pointing,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
think the finger example is good. Where so you start with the finger, and that's the form, and you think it just is a finger, and it has its own independent existence as a finger, and then you realize, well, it's a flock of cells. But even deeper than that, it requires everything in existence, the evolutionary history of humans and gravity and primates
right,
reaching for apples. All of that has to come together to make it. So it's empty of an independent fingerness. And
right,
at first you might say, oh, okay, the form is an illusion. There's just this like empty or interdependent arising. And then you're like, well, actually, it still does exist as a finger. I can still point to
right,
things. I can still poke things. So and that emptiness is the form. So it's like
right.
when you unpack it with the science, I think maybe a lecture from you would be a good intro for beginning Zen students, so they can instead of
Well,
just
and
chanting it.
yeah. And I'll tell you, I've done presentations on this in the context of Zen retreats, and the first time this happened was again at Upaya, which is not my base Zendo. I a student at Village Zendo here in New York, and my teacher is Enkyo Roshi O'Hara, but she and Roshi Joan and Upaya are Dharma sisters, so I would travel with my teacher to that center as her attendant sometimes. And I've done this talk as guided meditations in the context of a Zen retreat, and people have come back to me and to my teachers reporting awakening experiences, having heard this information. So for some people, it's useful in that way. One of the other things, and this is another key part of the book, the complexity theory just makes so easy to understand. The middle section of the book is on, as I mentioned, complementarity and something called holarchy, which whatever. um, and we'll save that for people who want, like, what does that mean? Read the book. But the heading for the middle is the boundless body. And coming back to the finger at this level of scale, and I use the finger because there was I was in Rome visiting a friend, and he said, "What are you doing these days?" And as I was about to tell him about complexity theory, there was a rushing sound in the sky, and I didn't know what that sound was. And I looked up, and there was a balloon over our heads, and then realized, oh, it was starlings. It was a murmuration because they fly through Rome. And I pointed at them with my finger, and I said, "That's what I'm talking about." And blah blah blah. And I used the finger thing. So that's always my so at this level of scale, our fingers, our bodies are bounded by skin, and it's very definite. You can draw a sharp line there. But at the cellular level, the functionality of this finger is dependent not only on your human cells, but of the microbiome that covers the surface of your cells, as your body is dependent on the microbiome that fills all the crevices inside your body. So, for example, we all have bacteria specific to our skin creases that digest molecules in that location to produce ceramides, which lubricate the joint. Without those bacteria, within hours or days, your skin will break down, you'll be open to infections, and you'll die without antibiotics. So you can't be a functioning human finger without your bacteria. The bacteria and other microorganisms, but the bacteria are the predominant ones. Our living human bodies are half human, half non-human. And if you eliminate the non-human, you die. You have no functional human body. So the finger at the cellular level includes these. And when you touch anything, a doorknob, or you kiss someone on the cheek, or you hit a keyboard and someone else touches it after, you're transferring some of your microbiome. And so we now know that in a household or in a workplace, microbiomes merge between human beings sharing the space, and even merge with those of cats and dogs and other pets that you have. So that the microbiome aspect of your body is actually shared by many people within a space. So at the cellular level, where's your boundary? It's the space you inhabit and all the other people, including all the other people. At the molecular level, where are your boundaries? Well, we're breathing out carbon dioxide and breathing in oxygen from the biomass of the planet. So, and there's exchange going on there. At the molecular level, you're at least as large in some respects in complementarity with the biomass of the planet. At the atomic level, there's no atom in your body that you didn't breathe or eat or drink from the planet. So on the one hand, we are living creatures walking around on this surface of this rock we call Earth, worrying about how we're independent of each other and isolated and alone. And on the other hand, we are the result of 3.5 billion years of the Earth self-organizing its atomic substance into living beings that think that they're separate. But at the atomic level, our boundary is the Earth. At the quantum level, we know, it won the Nobel Prize, so now we can be relatively sure of it. There's non-locality and entanglement. At the quantum level, there are no boundaries in the universe. Everything is within the universe. The boundaries of every particle are actually a field that extends in all directions to the limits of the universe. So at the quantum level, the universe is one single being, and our boundary is, we are boundaryless. All of those, so boundaries are also scale dependent. It's not only form, but it's separation is scale dependent. And those are complementarities. And we are always choosing how connected to feel on some level. And if we just focus on the day-to-day scale, we're very separate. If we can guide our imaginations downward, we're not separate at all. We're intimately connected with everything, with all life and with the entire universe. And that's part of the power of this scientific analysis, and what leads it into science that starts to touch on spiritual stuff. Then that's where the merger happens. So,
All right. Yeah, I think
that was a toot.
the so the picture that you're painting we spoke about earlier, with in the first instance you might think it's saying that things are illusory and actually they aren't what they seem, but then there's this two truths thing where you come full circle to say on a
Exactly.
certain scale, from some perspective, they are a certain way and not from another way. And I think this talk of boundaries is really, I love the way you're describing it, because the conventional, we have this habit of reifying things, right? So when we see a boundary, we think a boundary is a solid thing with its own objective existence, but it's really a process. There is no, you write in the book about, we kind of, as you say, the microbiome and shedding skin cells, and so it's like a threshold of a process, rather than a process that is connected to everything else. And
Yes.
I'll just share with you. So this is where I come down is that. So you say how with living cells they show this kind of self-organization, but then also molecules show self-organization, even atoms do. The thing that seems relevant to me is if you think in terms of thermodynamics, in terms of change, when you get to life, it's almost like you've got everything's dissolving, second law of thermodynamics, falling apart, and you get to life, and it's almost as if you shift into reverse, and suddenly you're resisting, you're keeping yourself together, you're keeping order together.
Right.
To me, that's the fascinating dynamic that just through looking at my own experience and human experience in general, the content of our experience seems to be really tied up with that. We care about, sex feels a certain way, eating feels a certain way, and they're all valence. Because they're all to do with survival, right? Like the most fundamental aspects of breathing, not breathing is a very vivid experience in consciousness. So that's why I end up, not because I think there's some really objective hard thing called a boundary in a cell, but I think it's that shift in the process seems where you suddenly a kind of meaning and relevance all suddenly can come into existence, because it's scaffolded to this central arc of I'm going somewhere, I'm a survival machine, I'm gonna keep
right. And this relates to the foundations of complexity theory directly, actually. So when we're talking about complexity, we're talking about the kinds of order one finds in systems of interacting things. And so there's a perfect order like crystals, where atoms interact with each other to line up and give this rigid structure, perfect order, or how billiard balls will interact with each other, and you can predict precisely where they're going to bounce depending on how they're hit. So that's a perfect kind of order. Then there's complete disorder, like molecules in a gas. And you can still describe that using standard mathematics. It's just statistical methods, because what's the average movement kinetic energy of each particle? And that's the temperature of a glass of water, or steam or ice. Then when we had computers developed, a new kind of order was discovered, and that was chaos, chaos theory, and governed by fractal geometries, fractal mathematics. And those you can't describe in a simple equation the way you can disorder and order. You needed to run a computer model. And in repetitive iterations, you see how a system of order evolves. And that describes things like the branching of trees, the organization of clouds, how, a good example of fractals, you look at how a river system divides and divides into a delta. But if I show you a black and white image and don't tell you what the scale is, I could fool you into thinking it's branching blood vessels in a lung. It's the same sort of mathematics. The thing about chaos, like the other things, it's predictable. It's reliably predictable. It's very complicated, not complex, just complicated. You can't look at the pieces of a chaotic system and intuit from what they look like what it's going to become. But if you model it over time in a computer, you can see its evolution. And if you start with the same starting conditions, you will always get the same outcome. And that's why we have good weather prediction now that we didn't have when I was a kid or your parents were kids. Um, you know, weather prediction when in the 1960s was really a laugh. You didn't know 1 hour to the next really what was going to happen. It's summer, it'll be hot was really as good as it got. But now we have apps on our phone that tell us the next 5 days ahead, and it's, you know, what hour it will rain, and it's pretty good. But it was noticed that there was a kind of order that wasn't captured by chaos either. And this was discovered in the early 70s, starting with a computer game called The Game of Life. And what was found there is that there was another kind of order, and this is what was recognized as complexity, that like chaos had to be computer modeled. But when you modeled the system, there was always, unlike chaos, it was not predictable. You could start with the very same starting points, but it would go off in different directions. And this is the mathematics that describes living systems. And this was complexity theory. And one can talk about the boundaries between these kinds of orders, like in a phase diagram. And complexity lies at the boundary between chaotic systems and perfect order. But that boundary isn't a straight line, it's a fractal. And you can wander around in that zone. So there's this limited degree of randomness. And that's the hallmark of life, that not too much randomness, too much unpredictability, you get no self-organization, you just get disorder. But too little, you just get a machine that can't change in response to changing conditions. So with a low level of randomness, like an example I use in the book, you look at a food line of ants. It looks like a straight line, and all the ants are busy carrying food to the colony and back. But if you look more closely, there's always a few percent that aren't following the line. Those are not non-adaptive. Those are the ants that if you step your foot in the middle of the line, those ants not in the food line are the ones that find a new route around your foot or are busy finding new food sources while the last one is being exhausted and will establish a new line on their own. And so this is what David Packard, one of the founders of complexity, one of the discoverers of complexity, called this life at the edge of chaos, which is what you're talking about, which is why I'm going on this another tune. And what he described it as, and what it's been recognized as mathematically, is this is a zone of universal computing a la Turing. Complex systems are universal Turing machines. And if you think exactly as you were describing, if you think how life has to take in information and process it, and this to me is the Varela notion of sentience, take in information, process it in a complex way, to produce more information that feeds into other systems. This is the most information-rich part of the universe. And if we think of information as an actual physical property of existence, that's physical is not quite the right word, but which is now how information theorists see it and many physicists. This is the richest zone of information processing, and that's what living things are. They're the richest zone of information processing, and that's where the magic comes from. That's what makes us alive, creative, adaptive, interacting, etc., but also prone to mass extinction events and inevitable occasional deaths of part of the system or the entire system. To be alive puts you at risk for that too. Two sides of the same coin again. Life and death are complementarities. You can't separate them.
Right. No, you have impermanence rearing its head.
Right.
So in the book, there's a bit where it made me think about, if you take the view that only humans are conscious as a result of their brains, you can make the case that it's valid to say the whole universe is conscious because of interdependence. It's like we're like the eyeball or something. We say this whole organism sees, even though the retina is the bit that's doing the transduction. But like without all of the history of the entire universe, even if it's only found in those places, you can still make that case.
I'm going to
So,
steal that example. That's a really good example.
welcome to it. But you're making the the more ontological case of like the kind of So I'd be interested in the nuances of this. Would you say kind of consciousness is the medium, the substance in which self-organization happens in your perspective, or kind of is it self-organization itself? Are they like synonymous? Is it
That's sort of where I was headed in my intermediate stages of complexity. But again, I had to wrestle with the direct experience from contemplative practices that that if you go deep enough into one's own mind, which cannot be an empirically scientific investigation by its nature, because the subject and the object are one there, and empirical science depends on subject-object split. And we know, again, if boundaries are porous, then there's never any such true thing as subject-object split. There's only subject-object split according to this level of scale where we're performing the experiment. Quantum physics revealed that to be inescapable. Complexity theory reinforces that. So when you look at contemplative practices, and those are not the only ways to get this direct experience. There, people through devotional practices, spiritual practices, or through the path of service, art, creativity, all can lead to a direct experience of how everything's interrelated, how form is emptiness and emptiness is form. The experience of that fed back to us from people who are adepts in this is that our minds are part of a vast non-dual mind. As you said, non-dual meaning containing no distinctions. There is no subject-object split. And all the panpsychist views don't account for that experience. And materialists will say, well, that's just an illusion. The way some materialists will even say our own minds are illusions. We don't actually even have minds. That's an illusion, though it begs the question of, well, what mind is having the illusion? And I see those, as I think you do, as data that needs to be incorporated. If you have a theory of consciousness that doesn't account for those data points, then you're still falling short. Right. And that's part of the reason, ultimately, I moved to an idealist perspective. Not the only one. There's a whole argument that's in the book about Kurt Gödel and the limits of formal mathematics and the incompleteness theorems, which is probably too much to go into here. But what that contributes is a clear understanding that the way quantum mechanics and relativity and complexity undermine the absolute truths of empirical science, formal mathematics doesn't step up to that plate either, that intuitions are required. And when you're talking about intuitions, what intuitions? Well, intuitions of how the mind understands the world, can grasp the world, but that includes how the mind can grasp its own nature. And people who dive in deep into that question find that consciousness is unbounded, undifferentiated, non-dual, just pure awareness. And so Manas, who I mentioned before, my collaborator, and I have written academic papers on this notion of fundamental awareness, is how we refer to this underlying non-dual mind. This to us is the only perspective that accounts for all the data points. And panpsychist and materialist views don't, despite some, there are researchers such as Stuart Hameroff who accept that these are real data points. But his notion that consciousness arises from space-time, he will say that it accounts for those, but I don't think he makes a good case for how it can do that, whereas this system does. And so that's what finally moved me.
Yeah, so I think it's, as you say, it's really important to synthesize these spiritual perspectives with the scientific perspectives. And part of the challenge is that there's not really agreement within the spiritual perspectives, so you could take what you're describing fits very nicely with kind of Advaita Vedanta, like Hindu people like Ramana Maharshi would say the ultimate is to realize this kind of sense of I am, that consciousness, that
Yep.
awake awareness. But then if you look at kind of the Theta model in Theravada Buddhism, where you've got these kinds of chains of identification that block you from liberation, there's still a few steps beyond that identification with awareness into kind of basically the insight that even consciousness is conditioned. Even consciousness arises through, I mean, this is one perspective,
Yes.
one that I align with, arises through the conditions of the totality of existence. So, and you said unbound. I think for me, you could say the unbound is what's even deeper than consciousness.
Right.
What's primordial is infinity, non-finite, unbounded, just openness. And within the totality of existence, through that, consciousness is an aspect of it. But as you strip back identification to being truly liberated, being truly just open to that unbound nature of existence, is, as living forms, is kind of the opposite of what we're conditioned to be. So it's
Right.
at each stage it makes sense that we try and grasp onto more and more ephemeral things,
Right.
kind of,
Right.
to not, yeah, because there's a fear of losing us, which I guess you do lose yourself in it.
And
yeah.
yeah, I think my guess is that you and I, if we could spend time uh, gnawing on this together, we would probably be in the same place. I think one of the issues for us is that we're speaking English. And so what words do we have? We have consciousness, we have mind, we have awareness, and then we kind of run out. I think what you're saying is the same thing as I'm saying it, but we don't have vocabularies that allow us to see that we're talking about the same thing. But if you look in Southeast Asia, you have languages with many, many, many words. And we know that within Buddhist schools, for example, Theravada versus Mahayana versus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Within Tibetan Buddhism, there are people who are mind-only school, and then there are other people who go, oh, you haven't gone far enough. I think that this again relates to complementarities, that there's always more to unpack. So if you think you've landed at it, you already know you're not there. But these are things, if it's boundless and unconditioned and without form and without any dualities, then there's no language that can capture it. So we're always dancing on the edge of understanding it. And that's why where I land in the book finally is I just acknowledge that there's no concept in this book that's going to help anybody. Because it isn't about concepts, it's about experience. And what I hope the book will do is help some people understand that pursuing an experience is a worthwhile practice. The way we jog to condition our bodies, or the way that people will now do puzzles because they want to avoid dementia. You can condition your mind too. Through practice, and there's diverse practices. It doesn't matter which one you choose, as long as it's one that suits your temperament. But if many people did that, because this book opens their mind to that, then I think that's my personal real urge to put this information out there. Every once in a while, someone will hear it and go, oh, I thought these things weren't important to contemplate or to act upon. And so that's the most gratifying thing, is it when I see it nudge someone towards pursuing that direct experience. That's meaningful. And that changes the nature of reality, which is also a complexity thing too. But
no, I love what you said about when you get nearer you get to the kind of core of reality, of what's at the bottom, you have to see that the map is not the territory, and you have to realize the limits of concepts. And so the way that I come to this is, my research in neuroscience was very much to do with perception and categorization because of a kind of awakening Kensho experience. And so it's interesting that you can tell different scientific stories that all point to the same picture you're explaining. So you're explaining through kind of these forms and how they emerge. And the way I tend to do it is to say, well, the only reason you think things are things is because the brain is doing this process of chunking things that's useful for you. So an alien wouldn't see a finger on your hand. They, may not, you don't even know what they would see. So it's interesting. There are these different ways of coming at it. But yeah, I think that's the ultimate. So many times I've had conversations with people where they think they're saying something very different to me, and I don't think we're actually saying anything different. So you even mentioned illusionist philosophers. There are times where I think I agree in a sense that, like, in a sense, I don't want to reify anything. I want to say that everything is the best it is process, and so like mind. I'm a monist, so I do think consciousness isn't like a different thing to the expression of the stuff we call matter.
Right.
And so, I might say neutral monism, but then again, we get to this point where, and there's even times where I'm tempted to say maybe there is some kind of the stuff I think underlies the processes that are expressed in living forms, maybe exist in some form below that. So maybe that's panpsychism, maybe that's idealism. And I think if you get to that point where you're becoming less and less attached to the labels because you recognize, okay, like we're getting close now because my language is insufficient. That's the really exciting territory. So I think that's great.
Yeah, no, that's precisely it. And I was worried, the interviews I've done for the book have been incredibly varied. Scientists, philosophers, people interested in design, people interested in architecture, people interested in medicine. People ask me, what's the book about? Well, everything. So, but I was worried when I got your invitation. It was like, oh God, is he going to ask me whether I'm a monist and what kind of monist? And, I get into these discussions and I'm like, I don't know. I don't have a mind for philosophy in that sense. And the labeling, there's so much about, well, what do you call yourself? And what does that say about what you think? So I sometimes get asked that and I'm like, I don't know. I'm telling you what I think. You can put a label on what I'm thinking any way you want,
I think we're both
I'm a Zen Buddhist, I'm a pathologist.
Yeah, I think it sounds like for both of us, the kind of experiential curiosity of this, of trying to kind of come into contact with reality, comes first. And the only reason we're talking is like that's a kind of secondary fun exploration of that. And that's nice because, as you say, like I'm definitely familiar with that kind of the intellectual wrestling match being the kind of point, and like that's kind of the egoic wrestling over ideas is not really what it's all about, I think.
Well, and I'm really lucky. I'm part of the reason. One question I get asked sometimes is, why did you come up with all this stuff? Partly, I'm just a nerdy kid. I'm not really interested in specializing. Ooh, another shiny object to learn about. Ooh, and so I've collected them over 65 years. 64, let's not rush it. But with Zen practice, in particular with koan practice, like when you meditate on, the most famous one is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You can't answer it in a didactic sort of fashion or a rational sort of fashion, and you can't gesture one hand moving, and it's like, that's not one hand clapping. A more typical koan is something like, does a dog have Buddha nature? And the teacher answers mu, which in Japanese means no or nothing. And the question, does a dog have Buddha nature? Well, humans have Buddha nature. Dogs are living things, but what is Buddha nature, etc. And the way to understand it is both that a dog is a dog. It's not a Buddha, it's a dog. Look, it's a dog, it barks. But that barking is its Buddha nature. Which is it? Does it have Buddha nature? Does it not have Buddha nature? Oh, those are complementarities. Listening to the Heart Sutra, it's these endless complementarities. The Zen training, Buddhist training in general, but Zen really sharpens it. That's one of its specific arts in Zen, is letting go that any one view is going to be it. Is it nirvana? Is the world nirvana, or is the world samsara? Well, if you say it's samsara, you've missed it. Okay, it's nirvana. No, you still missed it. And that's when the Zen teacher takes out their stick and hits you because you're trying to have it one way. That training for 35 years, I think, allowed me to be flexible when looking at the science and going, oh, this is like that. If you say it's this, sure, but what's the other side? And that conditioned me to reflexively ask that. And it sounds like you have the same, you have your preferred perspectives. Those are the ones you're expert in, and you feel it's good to feel like an expert. But you're aware that no, there are these other views too, and you're open to what light they shine.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think interest in this stuff started almost so partly in a place of kind of from that awakening experience of fascination, but also partly out of a place of dis-ease and of wanting to kind of be reassured, wanting to tell myself a story of like of knowing what's going on in a broader, yeah. And I think people can have these, they can get into kind of solipsistic spirals of thought, of anxiously worrying if they're the only mind in the universe, like that kind of, in that kind of state, people really want reassurance of some kind. So it's almost like a self-soothing exercise. I think it used to
Yeah.
be.
Well, and that was what I don't discuss in the book. I did in an earlier version, is an interest in mysticism started because I grew up as a child of Holocaust survivors. And so I had this devotional practice that was very rich and very pleasurable in Judaism, but I had this big question of how could that happen? How could God allow this to happen? And when I was 14, I discovered that there was a thing called mysticism. And I got this notion, oh, if you found yourself in unity with the divine, you would have the God's eye view and it would all make sense. So it was instigated by that was the fundamental question. And all of this has been, that's been the life's work that's in this book. And in the afterword, that's where I land. What does, this doesn't answer how could that be a good thing? But I've, in the teeth of mass extinction events, I've lived in the shadow of one. I lived through another as a young gay man coming of age and coming out during the AIDS era in New York. You may or may not survive, but what is the condition of your mind in that death or survival? Can you face it with equanimity, or do you face it with anger, fear, terror, suffering, and disease? Can you be resilient in the face of changes where your world is falling to pieces, or are you broken by it? I know survivors of both who were shattered, and I know people who were able to find joy in their lives. And I know people who dance on that edge. I mean, that's the nature, but that's the edge we all dance on. We just pretend it's otherwise. And I think societally, that's where we are now too. I finished the book on that point to some extent because of a conversation with a young friend of ours who's in his 20s, who after a little bit of drinking one night was really honest about his feelings about my generation and how we fucked over the world and what is that left for his generation. And I thought, well, if my book doesn't have something to say about that, then why have I bothered to write it? And where it comes down is our lives are always on that edge. And how do we face it? How do we, who are we in the face of it, and how do we survive it? Are we resilient and can still find aspects of bliss in it, or are you broken by it? And facing these questions, I think, helps. I think it can help. So
yeah, definitely. That's a beautiful place to end. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this.
all right. Thank you. Me too. I'd love to hear about your Kensho experience sometime. So if you want to talk more, I'd be really happy to.
All right. Is there anywhere else you point people to other than to the book, Notes on Complexity?
I also have a website that's going to have, we're putting in all my references for the academic side of this and lots of my online talks. So that's neiltheiseofficial.com. Thank you so much. This was really a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.